Everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the latest seminar from the Repairing Sociality, Safeguarding Democracy Research Group. This project is led by Professor Christy van der Westhuizen, a professor at University of the Western Cape in South Africa. Project also has collaborators based in Brazil, Wales, and Canada. I'm Chris Miller, a postdoctoral fellow working with the project based at the University of Ottawa. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Bonny Ibhawoh, who is a professor and Senator William McMaster Chair in Global Human Rights at McMaster University here in Canada. Our esteemed guest is the Independent Expert-Rapporteur and current chair of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development. He has taught human rights at universities in Africa, Europe, the United States, and Canada. Dr. Ibhawoh is Project Director, of Participedia, a global research network on public participation and democratic innovation, and founding director of the McMaster Centre for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. He also leads the Confronting Atrocity Project, a transnational initiative on restorative justice. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and today he will be sharing his talk titled Democracy and the Tyranny of Possessive Individualism, Reclaiming the Collective in Human Rights. I also want to introduce, we're fortunate to be joined by a discussant, Dr. Vinicius de Valle, who is a postdoctoral research at the Centro Brasileiro de Análise e Planejamento. Apologies for my pronunciation. His work examines pluralism, racial and religious identification, and everyday negotiations of difference in democratic life. Finally, last couple of housekeeping notes, and then you can stop listening to me and start listening to our speaker. In terms of the format, our presenter will present for around 30 minutes, followed by a brief conversation with our discussant. Then after this time, we'll open the floor to conversation. At that time, feel free to use the raised hands function, or you can type your question into your chat, and I'm happy to read it out if you can't talk on mic for whatever reason. Then the final thing, because I know we have people joining us from all over, captions are enabled for this meeting. If you would like captions, there should be a button at the bottom of your screen where you click Show Captions. It might be under More, those little three dots. If you would like translations into Portuguese or another language, you can also toggle that function as well, and then have the whole talk kind of simultaneously translated for you. It may not be perfect, but hopefully it allows people to enjoy this conversation in whatever language they would prefer. So that's enough for me, and I'll turn it over to our speaker, please.
Thank you very much, Chris, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and I really look forward to the conversation. What I'm hoping to do today is just to reflect on some of the concerns that I know many of us are thinking about. What is happening to democracy around the world? What is happening to these human rights norms and values that we've pretty much held sacrosanct since the end of the Second World War? Uh, there is a crisis. It is undeniable. We feel it in our communities. We hear about it in the news. And my reflections today is just one person's attempt to make meaning out of this. It by no means it's an attempt to prefer an answer to these big questions. It is a reflection, and I crave your indulgence to accept it in that spirit, and I look forward to the conversations that follow. If you don't mind, I want to say a little bit more about Participedia, where some of these issues come from. So I'll just share my screen very briefly, and then I'll go into the conversation itself. So much of the reflections I'll be sharing today come out of um, this project. It's called Participedia. I directed this project. It's been running for about a decade now, based here at McMaster University. And the project is founded on a simple premise: create a global network of researchers, educators, practitioners, and policymakers and activists trying to understand public participation and democratic innovation. One of the elements of Participedia is this crowdsourced database we've created over the past decade. It's a platform for researchers and activists and practitioners, and in fact, anyone interested in democratic participation, to share case studies. We have method studies, we have case studies, and we have organizational studies. And the idea here is really to provide a platform for those working in the spaces, whether they're academics, grassroots organization, or just community activists, to share their experiences of political participation. It is a semi-structured and semi-systematic database that seeks to capture many of these developments in real time. And what Participedia allows us to do, among many other things, is some form of sentiments tracking. What do people feel about their ability to engage and participate in governance, in civic life? Right now, we have over 2,000, or we were running to about 2,000 or 3,000 case studies now. Anyone can register and be part of Participedia as a community. We have a variety of case studies that speak to how civic participation is happening around the world and on the ground within communities. I'll just share some case studies that we have on Participedia that we've worked with, and I urge those who might be interested in learning more about this project to go to participedia.net, where this outlined. So this is a case of slum upgrading in Argentina, a case study on women's march in Washington, a case on participatory research in South Africa, a case on COVID community support in Italy. We have also collections. So I'm a human rights scholar. I do transitional justice. So we have a global collection of truth and reconciliation commissions that have been established around the world to address historical injustices and contemporary human rights violations. We also use Participedia as a tool, a classroom tool. Professors in many universities in North America and Europe mainly have drawn on Participedia cases for classroom teaching on democratic innovations, but beyond democracy, on civic engagement and civic participation. The government of Canada's Privy Council has drawn on Participedia as a database for its own engagement, civic engagement. Anyway, but that's the reason I've introduced Participedia is to give you a sense of where some of these reflections come from, the kind of trends that we are seeing through this database that is allowing us to ask some questions about the present state of democracy, the present state of international human rights, and what the challenges are. So let me start with a kind of overarching framework of what I'm trying to do today. So I'm trying here to examine how the intertwined crisis of democracy that I just talked about and human rights stem from what C.B. Macpherson calls possessive individualism. And it's a simple premise: the liberal notion of the self as an autonomous proprietor owing little or nothing to society. It argues my premise today is that these possessive ethos, these very atomized, individualist possessive ethos, embedded in both democratic and human rights tradition, has hollowed out collective life, reducing democracy to market competition and rights to individualized claims. So I'm drawing on historical and contemporary examples, many from Participedia case studies. This is what those who are involved in many of these initiatives have reported on Participedia, from postcolonial human rights charters to United Nations human rights instruments to our work with community organizations, climate justice movements. I propose that restoring democratic legitimacy and moral purpose requires a fundamental rebalancing, a rebalancing of the relationship between individual freedom on one hand and collective responsibility. There are many challenges to democracy as we understand it today in many societies. But what I want to zone in on today is what I consider a fundamental tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility. It is not an entirely new uh, identification of a problem, but I want to propose that it is really at the heart of the almost existential crisis that democracy faces today. So the two big ideas that I'm talking about today, democracy and human rights, have long been intertwined pillars of Western liberal tradition, which by most accounts, now provides a near universal model for organizing society. Democracy might not be the only game in town, but it is obviously the dominant game in town, liberal democracy, that is. Both emerged as moral revolutions against tyranny, promising dignity, equality, and participation for all. Yet today, like I said before, there is a fundamental crisis. Across the world, we see democracies fraying under the weight of inequality, disinformation, and political cynicism. We see populist movements that claim to speak for the people while eroding the institutions that safeguard their rights. We see liberal democracies where citizens enjoy procedural freedom but feel alienated from political and economic power. At the same time, the Global Human Rights Project, once heralded humanity's moral compass, is losing traction. Critics describe it as bureaucratic, elitist, and even complicit in sustaining global inequalities. There's also the long-standing cultural relativist argument that human rights, despite its claim to universality, is really a hegemonic framework for Western liberal ascendancy. I will not go into that long-standing theoretical debate, but I suggest here that these crises, both within democracy and human rights, are not separate. They share a common root in what I call the tyranny of possessive individualism. The idea that freedom means ownership, that the individual stands apart and above the collective, and that society's primary function is to protect the individual's rights to possess and to compete. Now, my use of the word tyranny is deliberate, is deliberately provocative, particularly in human rights discourse. Human rights is seen as egalitarian, as progressive, as a framework that is inherently emancipatory. And yet I insist on deploying the term tyranny to describe what I see as the contradictions of human rights. So there is a deliberation there to garner attention, but in some ways to provoke thought about this question. The concept of the self, powerful, autonomous, and self-contained, has shaped both democracy and human rights in ways that I argue now constrain their transformative potential. My argument today is a simple one, and it is this. If democracy and human rights are to survive and remain relevant, they must be reimagined through a renewed ethic of solidarity, reciprocity, and collective responsibility. And I think this is an idea that is gaining ground. I think more and more political leaders, within the context of global governance, are realizing this. Only last year, the United Nations, 150 world leaders gathered at the United Nations to sign a groundbreaking document called the Pact for the Future, the Global Compact. And if you read that document carefully, you'll find that the foundational premise is basically a questioning of this atomized, individual-centric ethos that seem to be driving at the core of democracy and human rights. So, to understand how we arrived here, I think it is necessary to revisit the liberal foundations of political modernity as I understand it. In the mid 20th century, as the world emerged from the devastation of the Second World War, a new moral order was forged around the twin ideals of democracy and human rights. The foundational document of the human rights framework is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it captured the spirit of that moment, a universal affirmation of the inherent dignity of every person, rights that pertain to each and every one of us simply by virtue of our humanity. You know, it's been described as a human rights revolution because up until then, rights were always contingent on citizenship, on ascribed status, on embodied status, but here were communities of the world coming out of the devastation of the Second World War, trying to affirm a universal human rights ethos. The focus was on protecting individuals from the excesses of the state, a moral response to the horrors of fascism and totalitarianism and Nazism. So the international human rights movement, I argue, came out of a particular kind of crisis. And if we want to be specific, it is the crisis of nationalism in Europe. Not so much the crisis of imperialism and colonialism in Africa and Asia. That is not what directly precipitated the human rights revolution. What precipitated the revolution was the crisis of nationalism in Europe. And the imperative of that crisis was to constrain the state, constrain the power of the state uh, in relationship to the liberty of the individual. A very, very unique set of crises prompted that revolution, the human rights revolution, that is. But this conception of rights also drew from an older liberal tradition that conceived of the individual as the primary and moral political unit. The Canadian political theorist C.B. Macpherson called this the philosophy of possessive individualism. In this worldview, the individual is seen as the proprietor of his or her own person, owning nothing or little to society for it. The function of the state is to secure that ownership. Freedom in this sense is the freedom to possess, to acquire, to compete. Macpherson's critique, I think, was prophetic. He warned that liberal democracy had built into it a contradiction. It celebrated equality in political rights, but tolerated deep inequalities in economic power. Over time, democracy became hollowed out, reduced to formal procedures, while substantive equality was left to the marketplace. The possessive logic continues to shape our global order today. It underpins not only economic neoliberalism, but also the way human rights are often interpreted, essentially as individual entitlements, disconnected from social duties, as claims against others rather than as commitments to others. And this is something that I see firsthand in the debates in the United Nations around the right to development. The tendency for many states and many policymakers in this space to insist on human rights being constructed as individual rights, civil and political rights, great priority, economic and social rights, not so much. We can see the effects of this possessive ethos most vividly in today's democratic crisis. Across continents, the liberal democratic model is faltering, voter turnout is declining, trust in institutions is eroding, citizens feel disempowered, seeing politics as a game for the elites. The idea of the public good, once central to democratic imagination, has been displaced by the pursuit of private interests. Neoliberal economic policies have deepened these malaise, of course, Over the past 4 decades, the market has colonized, and I use the term colonized very deliberately, nearly every sphere of life, transforming citizens into consumers and rights into commodities. The result, I argue, is a democracy that speaks the language of freedom but practices the politics of exclusion. Consider how inequality has grown within and between society, and some of these details are just mind-blowing. The richest 1% of the global population now controls nearly half of the world's wealth. The American billionaire Elon Musk's net worth is higher than the GDP of a significant number of countries. His net worth, which has exceeded $500 billion, is greater than the annual GDP of roughly 83% of the world's nations, leaving only 28 countries with larger economies. And I was told by a colleague in the business school recently that if you account for the $1 trillion that the board of Tesla recently voted as his compensation under certain conditions, he will be richer than almost all the countries of the world, save for 10 countries in the world. By any measure, this is obscene. This is obscene. Economic disenfranchisement has fueled resentment and polarized societies, giving rise to populist movements that fear, that exploit fear and nostalgia. In many countries, people are turning not towards more democracy, but towards strong men who promise protection and belonging. And we have seen this before in the pre-Second World War era, an era of strong men. And one wonders if we're returning to those days. These trends, I argue, expose a disturbing paradox at the heart of liberal democracy. It claims equality, but it reproduces hierarchy. It celebrates freedom, but it undermines solidarity. The tyranny of possessive individualism, this belief that we owe nothing to one another except for discretionary charity contingent only on the goodness of the hearts of the wealthy, has corroded the democratic ethos of shared responsibility. Human rights, too, have not been spared this logic. In their modern forms, human rights emerged as a language of resistance against state oppression. But they have become institutionalized as they have become institutionalized in international law and diplomacy. They absorbed the moral assumption of the liberal order that birthed them. Rights were imagined primarily as shields for individuals against authority, not as instruments for collective empowerment. This is why, even today, rights discourse finds it easier to speak of freedom of expression than freedom from poverty, easier to condemn censorship than to confront inequality. The hierarchy of rights that we are all familiar with, civil and political rights first, economic and social rights later, and at the very bottom, solidarity rights, such as the right to development, mirrors the hierarchy of values of liberal capitalism. As the historian Simon Moyne has argued, the human rights in the late 20th century became a project for making inequality tolerable rather than transforming its structural causes. NGOs and courts could defend victims from abuse, but they couldn't challenge the economic order that reproduced such vulnerability in the first place. And this is a point that I have raised with many of my colleagues who work in the NGO space. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, for a very long time, focused on torture and political imprisonment, political prisoners, civil and political rights, but would not touch economic and social rights issues. In fact, for both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, only recently, perhaps in the past 5 years, have they even begun to look at economic and social rights issues as fundamental human rights issues. And yet we know that the foundational premise of international human rights is that true human rights are not just contained to civil and political rights. They are also economic, social, and cultural rights. But somehow we've come to prioritize certain convenient rights over others, even as we speak the language of the indivisibility of international human rights. Thus, I argue, both democracy, human rights have become tethered to a possessive moral economy, one that privileges autonomy over solidarity and competition over empathy and care. Yet, this was never the only vision of human rights or democracy. From the 1950s onwards, newly independent nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America challenged a narrow liberal framing of both democracy and human rights. They argued that freedom must mean more than protection from the state. It must also include the power to shape collective destinies, to overcome colonial legacies, to overcome poverty, and to overcome dependency. This alternative vision has found expression in many regional human rights documents, famously the African Charter on Human and People's Rights of 1981, which emphasizes the collective rights of people as much as it emphasizes the individual rights of people. The ASEAN Human Rights Declaration of Asian countries, both documents affirm individual rights, but also recognize collective entitlements, the right to peace, the right to development, the right to a clean environment, the right to social welfare. Of course, these two are rights. Critics dismissed these rights agenda as revisionist and statist. So much of the discussion on collective rights have been dismissed as statist, a counterpoint to the primacy and the sanctity of individual rights. But they represented something much deeper, these rights, a democratic rethinking of rights as a shared moral enterprise. They articulated what the African philosophy of Ubuntu has taught us. I am because we are. A counterpoint to René Descartes' famous, I think, therefore I am. Ubuntu redefines personhood as relational. It insists that individual dignity is realized through mutual recognition and care. In this sense, Ubuntu is not the opposite of liberal democracy, as many may have argued, but in fact, it is the missing half. It grounds freedom in community and transforms rights from entitlements into relationships. I will now speak a bit to the area I work. So I chair the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development. And one of my mandate as a UN independent expert is to promote this long forgotten right. In 1981, the nations of the world came together in the General Assembly of the United Nations to adopt a foundational document called the Right to Development, the Declaration on the Right to Development. So this is a UN mandated right in international law, but it has all but been forgotten. When people think about human rights, development is not considered a human right. Nations, when they craft international human rights policies, do not countenance the right to development. So one of my charge within the United Nations system is to use the language of my mandate document, reinvigorate the right to development. Remind the world that this is a commitment that nations have made. And as we speak, there is a process to transition the right to development from soft law, a declaration, to a legally binding instrument. So there is intergovernmental negotiations happening at the United Nations now to develop a covenant on the right to development. Yet, if you ask many experts, international human rights experts, about the content of the right to development, you'll be hard-pressed to find many that really know what this right is about. It's been forgotten. The
Sorry to
struggle over...
interrupt, Bonnie. Just checking in with a 5-minute warning.
Okay, so I'm just rounding up now. So let us look at, so I've been talking about a lot of theoretical stuff. So let's zero in on the right to development. This is my case study. The struggle over the right to development at the United Nations illustrates how collective rights are central to renewing both human rights and democracy. The right to development proclaimed in 1986 recognized development as a fundamental human right to which every person and all people are entitled, and it places corresponding duties on states and international community to cooperate. Its premise is profoundly democratic, that people have the right to participate in, contribute to, and benefit from development. Yet, for decades, this right has faced opposition from powerful states who argue that development is a matter of domestic policy or market efficiency. They resist its implication for international cooperation and international law, and for redistribution that are obligations rather than choice. So the resistance of rich, powerful states to the right to development agenda is that international development should be a matter of charity, the goodness of the hearts of the wealthy, rather than a matter of international human rights. This resistance reveals the possessive core of global governance. Development is treated as a private race, not a collective endeavor. But with the crisis of our time, climate change, pandemics, global inequality, these all make clear that our futures are inextricably intertwined, entangled. The right to development, I argue, and this is what I do within the context of the United Nations, the right to development offers a democratic corrective. It redefines participation as shared agency and calls for an ethic of global solidarity. In this way, the right to development bridges the gap between democracy within states and democracy among states. It imagines an international order governed not only by competition of possessive individuals, but by the cooperation of interdependent communities. And we can also make this claim about democracy. We can make this claim about climate change, the challenge of climate change and our planetary commons, and how we address this. So, how do we address these challenges that I've outlined? I am arguing for a shift towards what I call a restorative humanism, uh, a renewed sense of democracy and human rights. What will these look like? I call it a restorative humanism, an approach that restores the balance between individual autonomy and collective well-being. Restorative humanism begins with a recognition that rights and responsibilities are two sides of the same coin, that liberty without solidarity is hollow, and that democracy cannot thrive without empathy and shared purpose. It draws on a diverse range of traditions, Ubuntu in Africa, Sarvodaya in India, Ren in Confucian ethics, Sumak Curse, the Good Way in Andean philosophy in Latin America, all of which affirm that human flourishing is inseparable from communal harmony. These are not really regional curiosities, they are universal resources for rethinking democracy and human rights in a fractured world. Democratic humanism asks us to reimagine the universal, not as a uniformity, but as reciprocity, a moral horizon built through dialogue among cultures, not imposed from one center, but multiple pluriversal centers. It sees democracy not as a finished product, but as a living practice of negotiation and care. In other words, work in progress. So let me conclude where I began. With the crisis of democracy and human rights, where do we go from here? The danger we face today, I argue, is not only totalitarian, it is not only inequality, but a deeper erosion of the moral imagination that animated the democratic and human rights ethos. We have come to accept that politics is about winning, that freedom is about possession, that rights are about self-protection and little more. These assumptions have hollowed out both democracy and human rights, as I've argued, To renew them, we must reclaim the idea that to be free is also to be responsible, that to have rights is also to recognize duties, and that the health of our democracies depend on the strengths of our solidarities. As Archbishop Desmond Tutu reminds us, my humanity is bound up in yours. This simple truth is foundational to both human rights and democracy, both within states and between states. The 21st century calls for a new democratic ethos, I think, one that moves beyond possessive individualism towards a politics of the commons. This means democratizing not only our institution, but our imagination, understanding that the fate of the individual and the fate of the community are inextricably intertwined. If the 20th century was the age of the individual, let the 21st be the age of the collective, the age in which our democracy and our human rights convictions are reborn as projects of shared human responsibility. This is not a claim for cultural relativism. This is not a call for a regression away from individual rights. Rather, it's a call for a rebalancing, a fundamental rethinking of that cosmic balance between the individual and the collective. I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Um, I'll turn it over now. First, just to Vinicius, who might have some questions to kind of get us rolling. But I encourage everyone to either put your questions in the chat now or start percolating them.
Okay, hi everyone. First of all, many thanks to Chris for the invitation and for bringing us together for this important conversation. Thank you very much, Professor Ibhawoh, for this rich and thought-provoking presentation too. It's a great pleasure to engage with your work at this seminar. I would like to raise a few questions that engage with some of the points you made. And my first question is about social media and algorithm and personalization in the context of your critique of possessive individualism. So you argue that democracy is in crisis partly because society is imagined as isolated and property-owning individuals. And today, social media algorithms give each of us a different information world, tailored to our individual profile. In your view, what role do social media and this kind of algorithmic personalization play in dynamics you described? And do the social media mainly reinforce this logic, or can they also be harnessed to rebuild shared publics and a sense of the commons? My second question is the following. In Brazil, we have cohesive groups with a strong sense of collective identity, which from a demographic perspective are still minorities, for instance, Pentecostal and evangelical communities. Yet, these groups sometimes intervene in the public sphere in ways that are experienced as oppressive by other minorities, such as Afro-Brazilian religious communities or even non-believers. From the perspective of your critique of possessive individualism and your call to reclaim the collective in human rights, how can we analyze this kind of situation and secure the rights of all without simply falling back on an exclusively individual rights framework? And thinking about democracies marked by deep ratios and religious diversity, such as Brazil, Nigeria, or South Africa, for instance, what challenges do you consider most significant for overcoming possessive individualism and imagining forms of citizenship and human rights that are genuinely solidaristic and plural in everyday life? And my last one is that many contemporary struggles, such as Black Lives Matter, indigenous land struggles, climate justice, or movements against extractivism in Global South, they mobilize both individual and collective claims. Do you see these movements as pointing beyond possessive individualism towards an alternative language of rights? And what do they teach us about what collective might mean in the 21st century? That's it. Thank you again.
Is the plan for me to address this first before we go into the general questions? I'm happy to
Yeah,
do that.
let's do that.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much, Vicentus, for those thought-provoking question. So let me start with the one on social media. I think the answer really is in your question. Social media, the rise of social media has obviously exacerbated the polarization. But like you suggest, it can also be an instrument for reclaiming these commons, the collective ideals that I talk about. And again, I'll point you to a document that was signed by these 100 leaders that gathered in New York last year for the pact to sign the Pact for the Future. One of the accompanying documents was the Global Digital Compact, which was a document that was also signed at that event. And if you read the Global Digital Compact, which I would encourage everyone to do, it's a short document. It's a recognition that technology is going to, the global community can either allow technology, AI, social media, all these wonderful innovations run amok and exacerbate the crisis that I just described. Or we could, through global governance, collective work, harness its potential and unleash it for the good of humanity. And someone kind of made the parallels with the atomic bomb, the discovery of atomic bomb. And it was recognized very early on that this would be a very powerful force for nations, for the international community. And the question quickly became, well, what do we want it to do for us? The International Atomic Agency was quickly set up, experts was brought in, and there was a sense that it has to be controlled. Now, in the nuclear energy discourse, there are those who would argue that regulation went a bit too far, and as such, it constrained the possibilities of using nuclear energy to address the challenges of climate change. But the point I want to stress is the response of the international community. And I don't think it will be an exaggeration to say that the developments we see today in AI, the potential to exacerbate inequality, the potential to create division, the potential for the enhancement of instruments of war could be likened to, nuclear energy, to the discovery of the atomic bomb. And just as the challenge in the 1940s and 50s was how do we constrain this powerful force we have invented? The same kinds of considerations, I would argue, should animate the global conversation about how we regulate AI and how we harness its tremendous potential in ways that benefit humanity. So, yes, and some of that conversation is happening, but those conversations, I would argue, cannot thrive in a context in which these possessive individualist ethos continues to guide the relationship between states and the relationship between communities. there has to be a fundamental shift. And I think it is also the responsibility of all of us, those of us who work in this space as academics, as policymakers, as community leaders, to begin to really speak to the need for a kind of rebalancing of this pendulum that I would argue has swung excessively towards a possessive individualist ethos. Um, the call to reclaim the collective, and I'm very conscious of this here, and that is why I ended my talk with an important caveat that I want to reinforce. This is not a rehashing of the old arguments for cultural relativism, whether in democracy or in human rights. Oh, we need to go back to the collective, and the collective is defined by what every group decides, in which the individual is once again subsumed and buried within the tyranny of the collective. So, to put it simply, the risk, the threat of a tyranny of the collective is just as real as the threat of the tyranny of possessive individualism that I just underlined. And I would like to really emphasize that democracy and human rights, at its core, was a response to the tyranny of the collective. You think about fascism and you think about Nazism and you think about authoritarian government. The premise is founded on an assumption that these are my people, I can do with them whatever I want. These are collective values. These kinds of practices are acceptable within the collective. And as such, they're immutable. The premise of international human rights, as one scholar has described, is the right to meddle, is the right to say, well, that might be the collective tradition, but they're universal human rights. They're universal principles. I guess my point here is that the pendulum has swung a bit too much towards the possessive individualist ethos. And what I'm calling for is a rebalancing, a reswinging of the pendulum somewhere in the middle, recognizing, of course, that that pendulum could very well swing in the other direction and we'll be back to where we started from. And so there's that important caveat, that I always put there. And I give the example of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, a very interesting human rights document that talks about the rights of individuals, but also in that document, a lot of sections talk about the collective rights of people. When I teach this charter in my human rights classroom, my students here in the West are always surprised to see a provision in that charter that talks about the duty of children to take care of their parents in old age. Yes, you have that line in the African Charter, a human rights document. And the philosophical debate we have in class is, should a human rights document have obligations? The duty of children to take care of parents, the duty of people to take care of communities. Doesn't that, in some ways, undermine the inalienability of human rights? Shouldn't human rights be non-contingent on duties? Shouldn't they stand alone? It's a deeper philosophical debate that we might not have time for today, but it speaks to the real threat that once you begin to speak the language of duties alongside the duties, questions of rights, there is a legitimate concern about whether you're now making international human rights contingent on duties. So you only have these rights if you do this. You only get these rights if you fulfill the obligations to society. And isn't the whole premise of human rights the idea that these are rights that pertain to individuals and groups simply by virtue of the humanity? So it is a fine balancing act, I have to admit, both philosophically and pragmatically. And then finally, I think this is also speaks to the last point you made about the claims. Marginalized groups mobilize both languages And I see that with indigenous communities, for instance, where you have chiefs within the community speaking the language of the collective, speaking the language of, solidarity rights and collective human rights and the commons. But within those communities, you have young people who are also asserting their rights as citizens, their individual rights. And there's always this tension between where the individual rights stop and where the collective rights begin. But my point, I think this really speaks to why I am calling for a reaffirmation of the collective ethos, is that the global challenges we face today, and I outlined some of them in my talk: pandemic preparedness, the next COVID, how do we address and prepare for the next big pandemic? Climate change, how do we deal with the existential crisis of climate change? The ethical use of generative AI, how do we ensure that this wonderful technology doesn't exacerbate inequalities? Uh, all these are global challenges, conflicts and wars, polarization. And no one country, however well resourced, can address them. And my argument is that addressing this question, and I speak from the perspective of my role at the United Nations, absolutely requires a recovery, a rediscovery of the collective commons. How do you deal with climate change without an affirmation of collective rights? How do you deal with pandemic preparedness without an affirmation of collective rights? Collective rights are central to how we make this happen because people experience the effects of either climate change or pandemics collectively. And so the responses have to be rooted in a sense of collective rights and a recovery of the collective ethos of democracy.
Thank you so much. The chat already has a couple of questions, and so I might just read one or two of the questions from there. This first one is from Becky. Thanks for this great contribution. Two questions from me. One, how would you describe nationalism in Europe today? Is it still in crisis? Two, given the choice between democracy and strong men, what are your views about coups in Madagascar, Rwanda, Burkina Faso, and the fresh on in Guinea-Bissau? Is this an inevitable reality?
Mm. Yeah, I can take that. So, nationalism in Europe, and I always emphasize this because, when I talk about human rights, there is an assumption that the world decided in 1948, enough is enough. Um, we we should live better. And then all of a sudden, voila, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. And I said, well, that's not the historical fact. The historical fact is that the international human rights system emerged because of a crisis of nationalism in a particular region of the world. It wasn't the long-standing crisis of colonialism, of imperialism in the 18th and 19th century. It was a particular crisis. And the response to that crisis is what triggered the human rights revolution. But it was a revolution that ultimately benefited the whole world. So if you think about it, when the United Nations Declaration on the Right to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted with its very flowery language and its very progressive language in 1948, two-thirds of the world was still under colonial rule, under colonial imposition. And so you had to confront the obvious contradiction that the statesmen negotiating this very flowery language of the inalienable rights of all peoples in the United Nations were holding fast to their colonies in Africa and Asia. And my typical example is the South African Prime Minister, Jan Smuts. He's credited with introducing specific language within the United Nations Declaration on the Right to Development, the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights. He was an active player in the formation of the international human rights system. Yet he presided over, in South Africa, one of the most atrocious segregationist regime. And he could make a lot, in his writing, he made a distinction. I'm talking about universal human rights for Europe. But I do not intend for 1 minute that these values we're espousing in New York, in San Francisco, would extend to my home apartheid country of South Africa or to any other part of the colonized world. So the logic, the contradictions were not going to be sustainable, obviously. And what happened thereafter was that, anti-colonial activists in Latin America, in Asia, and Africa quickly drew on that language and said, well, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. So if minority rights, that's so much of a concern in Europe, has to be addressed through this new international human rights framework, what about our long-standing demands for self-determination and independence? And so the point, to go back to the question, is that the crisis in Europe in some ways triggered a revolution, even though a global revolution, even though that might not have been the intent of the statespeople who negotiated this international human rights treaty. And I see the same parallels here, that, with the war in Ukraine and, the rise of strong men, not just in Europe, but also, in Africa, and all that, in an atmosphere of flux. Steady leadership is desirable. That is just a natural expectation. That some of these debates within Europe might once again, and this is just my thought as a legal historian, is that might again trigger those kinds of questioning around the world, for good or for ill. So I'll give you an example that the political leadership in the United States, political leadership in countries like Hungary and Argentina, the triumph of the strong man is providing a model, just as democracy and human rights provided a model out after the end of the Second World War. That this is a legitimate path to restoring stability, to restoring order within communities, not just in the Western liberal democracies, but also in emerging democracies. So to answer this question, I see the crisis of nationalism, in this case, not unique to Europe, but I would argue that the historical influence of Europe might shape how some of these debates evolve in other parts of the world. And I already see that with the conversations around human rights, where there is now a shift in how human rights are framed. The United States State Department reports used to be a standard for assessing human rights conditions around the world. But now that is increasingly being challenged and something that, it's not holding up to the norms as it used to. But it's not unique to any country that when there are challenges to democracy, when there's uncertainty, when people do not have faith in the institutions, there is a yearning for stability, there is a yearning for order. And I would argue that that is what we're seeing in many parts of the world.
Great. Well, thank you so much for everyone for joining us, especially thanks to Dr. Ibhawoh for your presentation today. And thank you, Dr. Diwale, for getting us going with our conversation. There are many more questions in the chat that I wish we had time to answer, but in the sake of time, we should wrap it up here, but I'll make sure to pass those all along to our speaker. This is our last event for the year, but we will have more a masterclass and more webinars hopefully coming in the new year. So I'm just popping in the chat our website, and that'll have our links to social media where you can stay tuned for more from the Social Repair Group. So thanks again to everyone for coming out. Have a great rest of your morning, rest of your day, wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you very much.